The racist, corrupt cops laughed at the black woman FBI agent in court, but minutes later, karma struck and destroyed their careers in front of everyone. They weren't quiet about it. The laughter echoed through the cold courtroom walls, bouncing off the polished marble like bullets aimed at dignity. She stepped up to the witness stand in her pressed navy blue suit, her badge glinting faintly under the fluorescence. But instead of respect, all she met were sneers. Mocking glances. Smirks exchanged like inside jokes. One officer leaned toward another and whispered, loud enough for the gallery to hear, "Looks like the FBI's hiring diversity points now." Another chuckled, shaking his head as if the very sight of her confirmed his worst assumptions. She better know how to mop up this mess. Literally. And then the laughter erupted, low, bitter, cruel. It wasn't just the officers. It was the defense attorneys. It was the clerk who refused to meet her eyes. Even the bailiff, who should have been neutral, allowed himself a crooked grin. And she stood there. Still. Silent. Watching. Swallowing every ounce of pain. The courtroom was supposed to be about justice, but in that moment, it felt like a stage, and she was the joke. The black woman in the middle of a room full of white men, all certain that they owned the truth. That they were untouchable. That their badges were shields against consequences. And her presence? A disturbance. An anomaly to be ridiculed, not respected. She had built a career on integrity. On resilience. She had fought her way through every door they tried to shut in her face, first as a girl in a neighborhood no one remembered, then as a woman in a bureau most people doubted she belonged to. She knew how to swallow anger. Knew how to keep her back straight even as the weight tried to fold her. But this was different. This wasn't just disrespect. This was humiliation, public and strategic. Because what she held in her hand, in a folder sealed with a federal stamp, was dangerous. Evidence. Truth. The kind that doesn't knock politely, it tears down careers. It exposes lies. And they knew it. That's why they laughed. Because fear disguised as arrogance is louder. They laughed because they could feel her power rising and it terrified them. They laughed to cover their panic. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to have found the gaps in their story. She wasn't supposed to have tracked the names, the missing reports, the coerced testimonies. She wasn't supposed to have spoken to the victims whose voices had been buried under paperwork and threats. She wasn't supposed to be smarter, faster, more relentless than every man in that courtroom. But she was. The humiliation that played out that day wasn't accidental. It was coordinated. They had met behind closed doors. They had prepared their strategy, not in law books, but in whispers and winks. Discredit her. Break her credibility. Make the jury think she was emotional. Unstable. Out of place. Let's see how long she lasts once we light the match, one of them had joked a day earlier. But none of them were prepared for what came next. Because hidden within that folder was more than just evidence. It was a declaration of war. Pages of documents, cross-referenced case numbers, emails they thought had been deleted. Names. Signatures. Witnesses who had been silent for years, finally brave enough to speak. Audio recordings of conversations they never imagined could be traced. Surveillance images no one thought existed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just spoke, steady and precise, while the courtroom slowly began to shift. The smirks faded. The judge leaned forward. The jury sat straighter. One of the officers glanced nervously at the others, as if realizing too late that the ground beneath them had begun to crack. That folder didn't just contain proof of their corruption. It connected them to a network of falsified arrests, racial profiling, planted evidence, and silenced reports. It painted a pattern so clear, so unmistakable, that even their allies began to step back. Even the silence from their side of the courtroom began to feel like betrayal. But here's what no one saw coming. The moment she rested her case, two men in dark suits entered the courtroom. Unannounced. Silent. They carried no weapons, just leather briefcases and stern expressions. They handed a file to the judge, a warrant issued directly from the bureau. Not just to investigate. To arrest. Gasps echoed. Someone in the gallery stood up. One of the officers tried to protest, tried to lunge forward, but was restrained. "You can't do this. We're the law," he shouted, veins bulging, face red. But no one listened. Not anymore. Because in that moment, the law belonged to her. One by one, they were led out in handcuffs. Not through the back door, not in secrecy, but through the same doors she had walked in, shoulders square, heart pounding. The laughter was gone. In its place, shock. Shame. Silence. The courtroom was never meant to be her battlefield. But she had turned it into one. Not with anger. Not with rage. But with truth, sharpened like a blade. And just when everyone thought the storm had passed, when the audience watching on the news thought they had seen it all, a final twist surfaced. One detail. One hidden thread she had kept tucked away until the end. One piece of information that, once revealed, wouldn't just destroy reputations, it would tear apart an entire institution. And that's where the Real story begins. Because what no one knew, was what she had really uncovered. Are you ready to hear the truth? Before we begin today's story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our Black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. We see you. We hear you. And we believe your stories matter. What you're about to hear is not just a narrative, it's a reflection of the real struggles, resilience, and power within the Black community. We hope this story moves you, empowers you, and reminds you that truth and justice always find their way. If this message resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button and help us share stories that matter. Now, let's get into it. Enjoy the story. Atlanta wasn't a city that forgave easily. Not for the people who were born in the wrong zip code, not for those who wore the wrong kind of confidence in the wrong shade of skin. And certainly not for a Black woman who had climbed her way into one of the most exclusive, most scrutinized rooms in federal law enforcement. But that's exactly where she was. Her name was Imani Carter, and the day she received her badge from the FBI Academy, she knew she was walking into a life that would always demand more from her than it ever would from others. She had to be sharper, quieter, stronger. Not just good, impeccable. There was no room for mistakes. No space for hesitation. She understood that with a kind of clarity that carved itself into her bones. Imani wasn't the type to talk about herself unless pressed. She didn't parade her accolades, though there were many. Born and raised in a modest neighborhood in West Atlanta, daughter of a postal worker and a schoolteacher, she had grown up knowing both love and limits. Her parents had stretched everything to give her what she needed, a decent education, a quiet home, and a belief that she could become something extraordinary if she never stopped pushing. That belief burned in her like a second pulse, one she carried through every job interview, every exam, every room that looked at her twice because she didn't look like anyone else there. Her journey into law enforcement hadn't been linear. Before the Bureau, she spent years in local investigations, moving from precinct to precinct, always under the radar, building a name not because people liked her, but because no one could deny her results. Cold cases warmed under her hands. Victims trusted her. Suspects underestimated her. She studied not just evidence, but people, their silences, their slips, their tells. It made her dangerous. It made her valuable. And eventually, it made her a federal agent. But no badge, no rank, no reputation could shield her from the deep-rooted decay she found when she began working on a case that pulled her back to her home city, one involving suspicious shootings, missing body cam footage, and an unusually high number of Black suspects with criminal records that didn't quite add up. She wasn't assigned to the case. She found it. Or rather, it found her, through whispers, through patterns, through stories that echoed each other too closely to be coincidence. Stories of planted drugs. Coerced confessions. Arrests that never made it to court. She saw something. She followed it. And in doing so, she stepped into something far bigger than she expected. The first names she uncovered were local. A few rogue cops with too much power and too little oversight. Men like Detective Ray Halston, a 20-year veteran of the force who carried his badge like a license to dominate. Halston was charming when he needed to be, menacing when he didn't. He smiled in front of cameras, mentored younger officers, and shook hands with politicians, but behind closed doors, he ran his unit like a gang. Then there was Officer Brent Mallory, younger, more volatile, with a record of complaints buried under a mountain of internal memos and missing paperwork. He followed Halston like a shadow, loyal, cruel, and eager to prove himself. At first, Imani thought the corruption was contained. A few bad apples. A cluster of manipulation in an otherwise flawed but functioning system. But the more she dug, the wider the circle became. Judges who dismissed evidence without explanation. Prosecutors who mysteriously declined to press charges. Victims whose testimonies were never recorded. It was all connected. And it led to one unavoidable conclusion: this wasn't just about bad cops. It was about a system that had decided who mattered and who didn't a long time ago, and had been protecting itself ever since. She brought her findings to her supervisor. She expected resistance. She got silence. Not even denial, just a heavy, loaded quiet. That silence told her everything. She was alone. So she did what she always did. She kept going. Alone if necessary. She collected the evidence piece by piece, built a timeline, linked the names, found survivors willing to talk. She compiled it into a report so detailed, so undeniable, that she thought, maybe, this time, justice would follow the truth. That hope was shattered the moment she walked into the courtroom and realized they had flipped the script. She wasn't there as a witness. She was the target. Subtle at first. A few raised eyebrows. A glance exchanged between defense attorneys. Then it escalated. The courtroom that should have been neutral became hostile. Halston and Mallory didn't even try to hide their smirks. One of them leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and murmured just loud enough, "FBI. Please. She's just a diversity hire playing dress-up." The words cut sharper than any cross-examination. Not because they were new, Imani had heard worse. But because they were being said here. In a space where justice was supposed to live. And no one stopped it. Not the judge, who looked on blankly. Not the attorneys, who chuckled behind their briefs. Not even the audience, who watched with a kind of morbid fascination as a black woman tried to stand her ground in a room designed to swallow her whole. The pain wasn't in the words. It was in the silence that followed. The validation of their cruelty by the absence of outrage. Still, Imani didn't fold. She presented her case with the same precision she always had. She laid out the facts. The links. The patterns. But every sentence was met with interruptions. Objections. Derision. They treated her not as an expert witness, but as an intruder. The courtroom became a performance space for humiliation. Halston played the role of the falsely accused. Mallory feigned confusion. Their lawyer, a man as smug as he was calculated, spun every piece of evidence as coincidence or misunderstanding. Imani could feel it. The tide of doubt rising in the room. She had done everything right and still, it was slipping away. Not because she lacked evidence, but because she lacked allies. The weight of their mockery pressed against her like a hand to the throat. Outside the courthouse, protesters had started to gather. Not many, just a few, but their signs were loud, their chants direct. They knew. The city knew. But inside those walls, it didn't matter. Inside, power protected itself. And yet, there was something in her eyes they couldn't erase. A quiet fury. A stillness that was never mistaken for weakness. Because deep inside, Imani wasn't just hurt. She was preparing. Every insult, every interruption, every smirk, it didn't break her. It sharpened her. She hadn't come for validation. She had come for the truth. And if no one in that courtroom was ready to hear it yet, she was more than ready to make them. What they didn't know, what they never even considered, was that Imani Carter wasn't standing in that courtroom alone. Behind her stood every person who had been silenced, every case that had been closed too soon, every family that never saw justice. She didn't just carry a folder. She carried a reckoning. And the moment it would begin, was closer than anyone imagined. The morning after the first hearing, Imani sat alone at her kitchen table, eyes fixed on the file that had become heavier than any weapon she had ever carried. The sunlight barely touched the hardwood floors, but the room was silent, heavy with a sense of something closing in. Her hands rested over the evidence like a shield, because that's what it was now, not just documentation, but protection. She replayed every look, every word spoken in that courtroom, searching for something, anything, that might have suggested she still had ground to stand on. But the truth pressed harder with each breath. She had stepped into a ring where the gloves were off, and no one planned to play fair. The system wasn't just indifferent. It was retaliating. Her phone buzzed with a message from her former field partner, Malik, one of the few she still trusted in the bureau. "Watch your back. That courtroom wasn't just an ambush. They're coming for your career." She didn't respond. She knew. She had felt it before the first word was spoken in court. The minute the prosecution team left her out of pre-trial strategy meetings, the moment her superior's emails shifted from cautious support to cold formality. They were building a wall, and she was on the outside of it. Later that day, she stepped into the federal building downtown, trying to act as if everything was normal. Her presence still carried weight in the hallways, but now that weight was laced with discomfort. Colleagues nodded stiffly, their greetings short. The ones who once laughed with her in elevators now avoided eye contact. The air felt different, charged, brittle, watching. And when she entered the elevator with Supervisory Special Agent Daniels, the air thickened further. He didn't greet her. Didn't glance at her. Only when the doors closed did he mutter, almost under his breath, "You should have let this one go." She turned, slowly, her voice low but precise. "I don't let go of corruption. Even if it wears a badge." He didn't answer. He just stepped off on the next floor and left her alone in the rising silence. That night, she revisited her files. She didn't just study the evidence, she dissected every gap in their stories, every inconsistency in their statements, every timestamp that didn't align. She noticed things others missed. In one report, Officer Mallory claimed he had arrested a suspect at 9:32 p.m., but body cam footage, at least what was left of it, showed his cruiser parked 5 blocks away until 10:07. Another document had conflicting witness testimonies that had been corrected post-arrest by Detective Halston's pen, his handwriting subtle but unmistakable. Bit by bit, the cracks widened. And through those cracks, the truth bled out. But it wasn't enough to know. She needed someone to corroborate it. Someone from inside. She arranged a meeting with Rosa Alvarez, a former dispatcher who had resigned quietly a year prior. Rosa had handled calls from that precinct and had once confided in Imani about a strange pattern, calls being redirected, emergency responses delayed or ignored. Rosa looked older than Imani remembered, her eyes sunken with years of silence. They met in a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. The tension between them was thick. Rosa gripped her coffee cup like it was anchoring her to the table. "You're not gonna like what I have to tell you," she said. Imani leaned in. "I'm not here to like it. I'm here to expose it." Rosa hesitated, then sighed. They used to call it cleaning the street. Halston and Mallory. They had this system. Certain calls they'd ignore, depending on the address. If it was from a housing project or a poor neighborhood, they'd take their time, or not show at all. But if it was from the suburbs or downtown, they'd show up with lights and sirens before the phone even hung up. And sometimes, they'd log calls that never came in. Pretend there were disturbances, get people arrested without any reason. No one questioned it. Imani's voice dropped. Did you report it? Rosa laughed, bitter. To who? The same people who promoted them. She slid a thumb drive across the table. I saved copies. Dispatch logs. Voice recordings. I was scared to come forward. But if you're really gonna do this, Imani nodded. She didn't have to say thank you. The look in her eyes did the work. Armed with Rosa's files, she expanded her case. She stayed up nights, connecting names, linking calls, comparing timestamps to arrest records. Her apartment floor became a battlefield of papers, string lines, maps. Every name she uncovered was another weight on her chest. Families destroyed. Futures stolen. Crimes fabricated. It wasn't just about Halston and Mallory anymore. It was systemic. Bigger than she had imagined. But she wasn't the only one digging. Late one evening, after leaving the building, she noticed her car door was slightly ajar. When she climbed inside, everything seemed untouched, until she reached for the ignition and noticed the folded note on her dash. It was typed, no signature. Just 2 lines, you keep going, you won't just lose your job. You'll lose everything. She showed it to Malik the next day. He scanned it, then looked at her, jaw tight. They're scared. That's why they're getting sloppy. Imani was unfazed. Good. Let them panic. I'm almost there. The trial resumed a week later. Imani walked into that courtroom not as a guest, but as a threat. This time, she noticed the shift. Not in her favor, but in the fear behind the eyes of those who once laughed at her. Halston didn't meet her gaze. Mallory's leg bounced restlessly under the table. Their lawyer was more aggressive now, short-tempered, interruptive. As if trying to knock her off balance before the weight of her evidence buried them. The cross-examinations were brutal. They questioned her professionalism, her motives, even her background. Agent Carter, the defense attorney, sneered during one heated exchange, "Isn't it true you pursued this case because of personal bias? You wanted to make a name for yourself. You wanted to play the hero." Imani stared him down, her voice unshaken. "I pursued this case because people are dead, families are broken, and your clients thought no one would notice." Gasps rose from the gallery. The judge banged the gavel, but the echo of her words lingered. Outside the courtroom, media presence had tripled. Protesters held signs with her face, with the names of victims. News anchors speculated whether this would be the scandal that finally exposed the rot within law enforcement. But Imani wasn't watching the headlines. She was watching patterns. And one night, in the middle of reviewing Rosa's files, she found something. A connection buried in years of dispatch logs. An address that kept reappearing. A name tied to multiple false arrests. A signature she hadn't noticed before, belonging not to Halston or Mallory, but someone above them. Someone she hadn't expected. She stared at the page, heart pounding. She read it again. Then again. It changed everything. But she couldn't act yet. Not until she was certain. Not until she had the final piece. Because the next court session wasn't just going to be another hearing. It was going to be a reckoning. And they had no idea what was about to be unleashed. The courtroom was silent in a way that felt unnatural. Not like calm before a storm, but like the breath before a scream. Imani Carter stood near the witness stand, not behind it this time, but just off to the side, with her hands clasped in front of her and her eyes trained forward. The prosecution team was seated, watching her, but saying nothing. They didn't know what was about to happen, not fully. She had kept it that way on purpose. One final piece of leverage. One final truth she had chosen not to share with anyone until this moment. Because now, after weeks of humiliation, threats, and isolation, it was time. The moment that would fracture everything they thought was indestructible. And she was going to do it without raising her voice. Judge Callahan, a man known for his restraint and sharp mind, adjusted his glasses and glanced toward her. "Agent Carter," he said, his tone measured, "you've requested to address the court directly, beyond your testimony. I've granted this under protest. You have 5 minutes. Make it count." Imani didn't move for a second. Then she stepped forward slowly, her heels clicking softly on the tile, every step intentional. The gallery was full. Reporters lined the back rows. The families of victims sat pressed together, their eyes fixed on her. On the defense table, Halston looked smug again, momentarily recovered from the damage she had already inflicted. Mallory leaned back, arms crossed, chewing at a fingernail. But their lawyer, Latham, was sitting upright, tense. Something in Imani's presence unsettled him. He felt it. The room felt it. She reached into the folder she carried and placed one single sheet of paper on the stand. Then she looked up. "I came here to testify," she said, her voice clear, "but what I needed to do was expose." The judge frowned slightly, but didn't interrupt. "What I'm holding," she continued, lifting the paper slowly, "is not a theory, not an opinion. It's a sworn deposition from a federal informant. Taken 3 days ago. It links officers Raymond Halston and Brent Mallory not just to falsified arrest records or abuse of power, but to a coordinated scheme involving obstruction of justice and conspiracy to silence witnesses." There was a murmur in the room. Latham stood up. "Your Honor, I object to this grandstanding." "Sit down," Callahan snapped before Latham could finish. "Let her speak." Imani turned back toward the room. Her hands didn't shake. "The name of that informant," she said slowly, "is Terrence Waller. Former crime analyst. Fired 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He's never spoken publicly about why. But I have him on record. And he didn't just implicate these officers. He named a higher authority." She turned, lifted another document, and laid it gently in front of the judge. "This is an internal memo sent from Waller to Deputy Director Harold Niles. It contains complaints regarding data manipulation in precincts tied to Halston and Mallory. It's dated 6 months before Waller was fired. 6 months before he disappeared from Bureau records." Now even the prosecution was leaning forward. The room's energy changed. Judge Callahan adjusted his seat. "Go on," he said, quieter now. "I cross-referenced every arrest made by Halston and Mallory between 2015 and 2022. I found a pattern. And then I looked at which cases were escalated, which suspects were denied bail, which attorneys failed to show up in court. It's all tied to a financial kickback system buried within the department. People were paid to stay silent. Promotions were given to those who played along. And the one person who tried to raise an alarm, Waller, was erased. Until now." Mallory was pale. Halston shifted forward in his seat, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching. "This is a joke," he muttered under his breath, but the panic was blooming beneath his skin. Imani locked eyes with him. "You remember a woman named Darnisha Hill?" she asked. "You arrested her in 2018. Said she had meth in her glove compartment. There was no meth. No drugs at all. You planted a pipe. But the dash cam from the gas station across the street caught you opening her car door before backup arrived. That footage disappeared." Halston shook his head. "You can't prove that, I don't have to," she cut in, sharper now. "The station owner had a habit of saving everything to a cloud backup. And when I found him, he handed me the footage. Along with 4 other victims with the exact same story. Same names on the reports. Now the courtroom was rumbling. Whispers turned into audible gasps. The jury sat frozen. The judge didn't stop her. But then, something even more powerful than facts entered the room. Someone. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened slowly. 2 federal agents stepped inside. And between them walked a tall, quiet man in a brown suit. Bald. Nervous. Terrence Waller. Alive. Present. Willing to speak. Halston's eyes widened. No, he breathed, he's dead, I saw. Imani turned to him, voice like a blade. You saw him disappear. But you didn't bury him deep enough. Terrence stepped forward, holding a hard drive in one hand. One of the agents nodded to the judge, who leaned in as a clerk whispered in his ear. The judge's face changed. A long pause passed. Then he turned to the defense table. I've just been informed that the evidence presented by Agent Carter has been verified by federal cybersecurity officials. Mr. Latham, your clients are now subject to immediate arrest under Title 18 for conspiracy, obstruction, and civil rights violations. Halston exploded from his chair. This is a setup. She's lying. This isn't justice, this is revenge. Imani stepped forward. No. This is what justice looks like when you can't silence it. The agents moved in. Mallory tried to run. He was tackled by a bailiff before he reached the gallery. Handcuffs snapped tight. Halston resisted, yelling, twisting, but the room no longer cared about his noise. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Some cried. Reporters rushed out to blast headlines across every screen in the country. But Imani didn't move. She stood there, watching them be led out in chains, the sound of their cuffs like music in her ears. And yet, there was no smile on her face. No satisfaction. Just a long, quiet exhale. Years of resistance, betrayal, and loneliness had led to this one moment. Judge Callahan called for order. This hearing is suspended pending a full federal investigation. All involved parties are to be taken into custody immediately. Imani stepped away from the stand. As she did, Malik, standing by the gallery, met her eyes. He didn't speak. He just nodded. She had done it. And yet, something still lingered. Because in her bag, she carried one more document. One more name. One more revelation. And when it came out, it wouldn't just end careers. It would burn institutions to the ground. The courthouse didn't empty quickly. Even after the handcuffs clinked and the courtroom doors slammed behind the disgraced officers, the room remained frozen, suspended in disbelief. People sat motionless, as if their minds hadn't caught up with what their eyes had witnessed. The sound of chairs shifting was cautious, hesitant, like no one quite trusted that it was over. Imani didn't move for a long time. She stood near the witness stand, her shoulders square but her chest tight, eyes fixed not on the space Halston and Mallory had occupied, but on the silence they left behind. And in that silence, something deeper stirred, not relief, not yet, but a trembling sense of justice finally beginning to exhale. The judge stepped out. The prosecution team huddled. Reporters rushed down the stairs, phones in hand, calling editors and screaming headlines. But Imani was still. Her palms were damp, her muscles locked, and it wasn't because she doubted what had just happened, it was because she knew what was coming next would be bigger. She had released the first blow. But the second one, the final one, was still in her hands, and it was heavier than anything she'd carried so far. Malik approached her quietly, his voice low. You okay? He asked. She didn't answer at first. Her gaze flicked toward the judge's bench, then to the gallery where families sat with trembling lips and wet eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly. I'm not finished, she said. Not yet. He glanced toward the bag she carried, the same one she had clutched from day one. You gonna do it now? He asked. Her reply came without pause. It needs to be public. They stepped into the hallway, where a crowd had already formed. Cameras flashed. Microphones were raised. Questions flew like arrows. Agent Carter, were you aware of Terrence Waller's survival before this week? Was the Bureau complicit in the cover-up? Are more arrests coming? She didn't respond. Not yet. But every step forward, every blink under the blinding flashes, felt like walking into a fire she was finally ready to start. A press conference was hastily arranged. The podium was placed outside the courthouse steps, in front of a sea of reporters, citizens, and protesters who had turned their signs into banners of solidarity. Imani stood tall as the sun began to set behind her, casting a golden light that split across the building's stone pillars like judgment. Malik stood beside her, silent but unwavering. Rosa Alvarez appeared at the edge of the crowd, her eyes wide, her chin high. When she began to speak, her voice carried over the crowd like a wind carving through stone. Today, justice has taken its first step forward in this city, she said, her tone measured but heavy. Detective Halston and Officer Mallory were not anomalies. They were symptoms of a larger disease, one that has infected not just apartments, but entire systems meant to protect and serve. The murmurs swelled. The cameras inched closer. She continued, her voice sharper now. And today, I have one final truth to reveal. She reached into her bag, pulled out a second envelope, this one thicker, bound with a red string, and held it up. This document, she said, contains communications between multiple high-ranking law enforcement officials and select individuals within the district attorney's office. These communications detail a coordinated effort to suppress investigations, bury evidence, and actively discredit federal agents attempting to pursue corruption charges. Among the recipients of these messages, is Deputy Director Harold Niles. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. It wasn't just shock, it was outrage. Betrayal. Because Niles had presented himself as the voice of order, a stabilizing force in the Bureau. Imani unfolded one of the emails. This is from February 3rd. It reads, if Carter keeps pushing, we'll need to bury her or bury what she finds. Either way, make sure she's out of the picture before the hearing. The crowd erupted. Microphones swayed. Reporters shouted over each other. She let the noise rise. She let it build. Then she raised her hand for quiet. It took time, but eventually, silence returned. I have submitted this file, she said, to the Department of Justice, to the Inspector General's office, and to federal oversight committees. As of this morning, a full investigation has been authorized. This is not over. But it is beginning. She stepped back. And then the questions surged again. One reporter pushed forward, voice trembling. Agent Carter, how did you keep going? With so much against you, how did you keep moving forward? Her eyes locked with his. Because I remembered every victim. Every mother who cried. Every young man whose life was stolen. I remembered my father telling me that silence keeps us shackled. And I remembered that power only wins when people forget who they are. I never forgot. Behind her, Rosa began to cry. In the distance, someone yelled her name, just once, and it echoed like something sacred. Later that evening, Imani walked into her office for the first time in days. It was late. The halls were empty. She turned on the desk lamp and sat down slowly. The caseboard was still up, still filled with names, dates, pictures of people long discarded by the system. She stared at it, letting the stillness settle. Then there was a knock at the door. Malik stepped in. He had 2 coffees in hand, one already half empty. You're officially infamous now, he said, smirking tiredly. People are calling you the woman who broke the blue wall. Imani exhaled. It wasn't just me, she said. It was everyone who spoke. Everyone who stayed when it was easier to walk away. He nodded. Then after a pause, he said, "There's talk going around. They're trying to push Niles out. They might offer you his seat." She blinked, slowly. "I didn't do this for promotion," she said. Malik smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve one." There was silence between them for a moment. Not awkward, not tense, just full. Then she looked back at the board. "I want every case tied to those names reopened," she said. "All of them. No more hiding." Malik raised his coffee. "To the storm," he said. She lifted hers. "To the reckoning." Outside her window, the city moved like it always did, fast, unpredictable, messy. But for once, it felt like it was listening. And she wasn't done speaking. In the days that followed the courtroom explosion, Atlanta didn't just react, it ignited. The arrests of Halston and Mallory made national headlines, and Imani Carter's name was suddenly everywhere. People she had never met shouted her name on city corners, painted it onto signs, hashtags, and murals. But for Imani, the moment was far from a victory lap. Inside her, the adrenaline of the confrontation had given way to something heavier, a sobering understanding that tearing down a wall was only the beginning. What came next was the debris, the rot underneath, the quiet reckoning of what had been allowed to fester for so long. And that debris was alive, angry, and still very capable of damage. On the surface, the Bureau scrambled to respond. Official statements were vague, measured, full of promises about accountability and reform. But inside the walls of the agency, there was division. Some agents avoided her altogether, retreating into silence or transferring out of the office entirely. Others, like Malik, stood beside her more openly now, no longer afraid of the implications. But the most dangerous reactions were the ones behind closed doors, the quiet meetings she wasn't invited to, the documents that began disappearing from internal databases, the friendly voices that suddenly stopped returning calls. It was during a routine file audit that Imani discovered several of her previous reports had been altered. Key pieces of language missing. Dates slightly modified. Signatures moved. It was subtle enough to be deniable, but deliberate. She documented everything. She printed backups. She began using external storage. She had learned that speaking truth to power meant also guarding it with your life. But even as she tried to protect the integrity of what she had uncovered, another dilemma began to gnaw at her, one deeper, more personal than any threat of retaliation. Terrence Waller had gone into federal protection following the hearing. It had been necessary, given the level of threat, but it meant that he would not be available for further questioning or public statements. Imani respected the need for his safety, but it left a gap in the public narrative, a gap critics were beginning to exploit. Certain media outlets spun conspiracy theories, suggesting that Waller had been coerced, or worse, fabricated. They questioned his mental state, his motivations, his past. And with each seed of doubt they planted, they tried to erode the foundation she had spent months building. The Bureau didn't defend him. It didn't defend her either. And so, she found herself facing the same truth again: if she didn't speak, they would rewrite everything. Meanwhile, the deeper investigation into Deputy Director Harold Niles was stalling. The Internal Review Board claimed to be examining the evidence, but no action had been taken. Whispers suggested that Niles had gone quiet, not retired, not resigned, just retreated into layers of bureaucracy thick enough to disappear behind. Imani received word that he was still accessing systems remotely, still making phone calls, still meeting with high-ranking officials. He hadn't fallen. He had only crouched. One evening, she received an unmarked envelope slipped under her apartment door. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an itinerary for a private bureau leadership retreat, scheduled at a remote location in Virginia. Niles was on the list. Several other names were familiar. Men she had investigated. Men who had quietly survived. At the bottom of the list, a handwritten note: "They're preparing to bury this. Be ready." She sat for a long time that night, holding the paper like a confession. The dilemma wrapped itself around her. She had the platform now. She could speak. She could burn everything down if she wanted to. But doing so would not just scorch the guilty, it would incinerate every fragile piece of trust the public still held in federal justice. And she knew what that could cause. Riots. Panic. Collapse. Was the world ready for the truth to come all at once? Was she? Malik called the next day. His voice was cautious. "I heard about the retreat," he said. "People are talking. Not loud, but it's moving." Imani responded quietly, "They're reorganizing. Choosing who gets to survive this. Who gets to wear the mask of reform while keeping the same machine running." Malik hesitated. "You want to crash it?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "No. I want to expose it. But I don't want to create chaos. I want people to know what was done to them, not just rage about it." That's when Rosa suggested something radical. A live-streamed town hall. Not through official channels. Not through the Bureau. But through a neutral platform, public, transparent, and open to community questions. Imani was hesitant. It would make her a target again. Not just professionally, but physically. Rosa looked her in the eyes and said, "That's what they're counting on, that you'll be too tired to fight again. That you'll choose peace over truth. But peace built on lies always rots." And so she did it. The town hall was scheduled 3 days later. A borrowed auditorium. Independent cameras. A crowd that overflowed into the street. Imani walked onto the stage with no suit, no badge, no prepared speech. Just her voice and the evidence she had guarded like sacred scripture. She spoke of the cases no one saw. The victims who never got headlines. She named names. Played clips. Showed emails. And then she did something no one expected. She invited families to speak. One by one, they stepped forward. Mothers, brothers, sons. They didn't shout. They told stories. Real ones. Human ones. And as they did, something changed. The air in the room grew heavier, not with rage, but with understanding. With the weight of memory. When it was over, a reporter asked her if she still believed in the system. She paused. Then she said, "I believe in the people who survive it. I believe in the ones who fight to change it. But the system? No. Not until we rebuild it. And we can't rebuild anything if we don't first see it for what it is." Back in D.C., phones rang. Pressure mounted. The Bureau's official response was delayed, stalled by internal conflict. Whispers turned to meetings. Investigations into Niles gained traction again. This time, led not by internal teams, but by an independent panel formed by public demand. The power of truth wasn't just in its exposure, it was in its ability to galvanize those who had once felt powerless. But the cost remained. Imani's name was now both a symbol and a target. She received threats. Her apartment was moved. She couldn't walk freely anymore. Malik offered protection. She refused. "I'll never be invisible again," she told him. "Let them see me. Let them know I'm not afraid to be seen." Yet late at night, when the world was quiet and the city felt distant, she sat by her window and let herself feel everything. The sorrow. The anger. The weight of being one voice against an ocean of silence. She thought of her parents, long gone. Of the little girl she once was, who dreamed of wearing a badge. She wondered what that girl would think now. And then she smiled. Because that girl would understand. That girl knew the price of truth. And the truth was, nothing would ever be the same again. But it had to begin somewhere. And it had begun with her. The night after the town hall, the city didn't sleep. Online, videos of Imani's speech flooded every platform. Her words, raw and unfiltered, had struck a nerve deeper than even the courtroom victory. This wasn't just about corrupt cops anymore. It had become something else, an awakening. But with every wave of support came another wave of hostility. The footage of families crying on stage was shared side by side with anonymous threats, fabricated articles, and orchestrated attempts to discredit her credibility. Some claimed she was an operative for political agendas. Others said she had doctored the evidence. But through all the noise, one thing stood out with alarming clarity: the public was watching, and they were no longer content to look away. Still, that visibility was a double-edged sword, and Imani could feel the sharpness pressing closer with each passing hour. The next morning, her apartment building was surrounded by news vans and flashing cameras. She didn't walk out the front door. She left through the back stairwell with Malik, wearing a hoodie and dark sunglasses, her bag slung over her shoulder, her badge no longer displayed on her belt. They walked in silence for blocks before ducking into a cafe, one of the few places where she still felt unknown. Malik sat across from her, watching her hands tremble slightly as she gripped the coffee mug. He didn't say anything at first. Then finally, his voice broke through the quiet. "They're calling for hearings," he said, "a full Senate panel. You're on the list. You'll be asked to testify." Imani looked up slowly, exhaustion painting every angle of her face. "Good," she said. "Let them ask. I'll give them what they should have demanded years ago." Malik leaned forward. "You realize they'll try to twist this, right? Turn you into the villain. They'll accuse you of tearing down the bureau. Of feeding distrust." Imani exhaled through her nose. "Let them. If people trusting the truth means they lose faith in a lie, then maybe that faith wasn't worth saving." Her tone was calm, but underneath it was a storm. Malik knew it well by now. He nodded slowly, absorbing her words, but his eyes betrayed a quiet fear. "Just promise me you'll be careful," he said. "Because the people you've cornered, they're not just losing jobs anymore. They're losing power. And people like that don't fall quietly." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Later that afternoon, she met with Rosa again. They walked through a quiet park on the edge of the city, the trees shaking slightly in the early fall breeze. Rosa carried a manila envelope filled with newly surfaced documents, records of erased body cam footage, internal memos referencing suppression tactics, and a list of legal cases quietly settled out of court with confidentiality clauses attached. Imani skimmed the papers, her brow furrowed. "This is deeper than we thought," she murmured. Rosa sighed. "They've been burying this for over a decade. Entire families paid off just to disappear. Judges signing NDAs. Defense lawyers dropping cases without warning. You were never just exposing cops. You were pulling the cover off an entire network." Imani stopped walking. Her eyes scanned the horizon, then settled back on Rosa. "Then I guess the real question now is, do we dismantle the network or expose every single person who built it?" Rosa's response was a long, haunted pause. "Both." That night, Imani couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk, stacks of papers surrounding her like walls, the hum of her laptop filling the space. She opened an encrypted email account, one she rarely used, and composed a message addressed to 3 separate investigative journalists. She attached scanned documents, audio recordings, verified transcripts, and her own case notes. She didn't write a long explanation, just a sentence: "If anything happens to me, this goes public." Then she set the timer on the email. 72 hours. If she didn't deactivate it manually, the entire archive would be released automatically. She leaned back, her breath trembling. The weight of it all had settled on her shoulders like a second body, one she had carried too long without rest. She thought about calling Malik. Then thought better of it. She didn't want comfort. She needed clarity. And that came only in solitude now. The next day, her summons to D.C. arrived. She was to appear before the Senate Oversight Committee within the week. She packed quietly, deliberately, choosing her words for testimony with care. But something kept tugging at her, something she hadn't said yet, something she hadn't confronted. The night before her flight, she visited the home of one of the families who had spoken at the town hall. The mother, Mrs. Harris, had lost her son in a traffic stop years ago. His name had been among the first Imani discovered in the fake reports. Mrs. Harris welcomed her inside without question, her living room lined with framed photos of the boy she had raised. Imani sat with her on the couch, surrounded by memories and silence. After a while, the older woman spoke, her voice thin and shaking. "I don't know what justice looks like anymore," she said. "All these people talk about investigations and reforms, but my baby's still gone. They don't get to fix that. You can't fix that." Imani reached for her hand. "No, I can't," she said softly. "But I can make sure the truth gets louder than their lies. I can make sure they can't do this again." Mrs. Harris nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Then don't stop," she whispered. "Even when it gets ugly. Even when it costs you everything. Don't stop." That night, Imani returned to her apartment, packed the last of her files, and stood by the window, staring out into the city that had become both battlefield and home. The storm hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. The fight ahead wasn't about exposing corruption, it was about reshaping what justice even meant in a place where so much had already been stolen. The next morning, she boarded the plane to D.C., a single leather folder resting on her lap. Inside it were names, timelines, facts, but more than that, there was a story. Not just hers. Not just the Bureau's. But the story of a country deciding whether to face itself or keep looking away. And as the plane rose into the sky, she closed her eyes, not to escape the noise, but to gather strength for the next room she would enter. A room where truth would not be convenient. A room where the people in power would not want to listen. But she would speak anyway. The halls of Capitol Hill felt colder than she imagined. Not just from the air conditioning, but from the way everything inside it was so perfectly still, so tightly controlled. Imani walked with slow, deliberate steps, her heels echoing through the long corridors like a warning bell. She was flanked by two staffers, one ahead, one behind, both barely speaking, guiding her through the building as if she were a witness being transported to a battlefield, not a professional called upon to speak truth. Every corner she turned was lined with portraits of power, faces carved into stone, eyes painted to look wise, authoritative, untouchable. But none of them looked like her. None of them held her story. And yet, it was her words that had brought this building to attention. They led her to a waiting room outside the hearing chamber. She sat, eyes closed, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Across the room, Malik waited too, leaned against the far wall, arms crossed. He hadn't said much on the flight or in the hotel. He knew what this meant to her. He knew not to speak for the sake of filling space. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "You don't have to answer everything they throw at you. Remember that. You owe them the truth, but not your soul." Imani looked up, the corners of her mouth pulling slightly. "I stopped giving away my soul a long time ago." Malik nodded. "I just want you to walk out with it intact." A committee assistant opened the door. "Agent Carter, they're ready." She stood, adjusted the blazer that now felt more like armor, and walked into the chamber. It was a high-ceilinged room with deep wood panels and polished brass, filled with people who looked like they'd been sitting in judgment since the beginning of time. There were senators at the long curved desk, their expressions ranging from eager to skeptical, staffers typing quickly, cameras rolling silently, and a gallery filled with reporters, activists, and observers, each of them holding their breath for what she might say. The chair was positioned dead center. Exposed. She sat slowly. The microphone in front of her buzzed as it turned on. A senior senator cleared his throat. Agent Carter, thank you for being here. We recognize the personal risk you've taken to bring these matters forward. Today, we are seeking clarity, accountability, and evidence. She nodded, voice steady. You'll have all three. The first questions were procedural: dates, policies, personnel structures. Imani answered each with precision, drawing from memory, from the files she had lived inside for months. But then came the shift. Senator Whitmore, a sharp-eyed man from Texas, leaned forward. Agent Carter, do you believe your actions have damaged the credibility of federal law enforcement in the eyes of the public? She didn't blink. I believe silence and complicity did that. I believe my actions gave people a reason to hope that accountability is possible. The senator's mouth tightened. And yet your revelations have led to the arrest of multiple officers, the resignation of judges, and the ongoing investigation of a deputy director. Are you concerned about destabilizing the institution you were sworn to serve? Her reply was slow, deliberate. Institutions are not made of walls and offices. They are made of people. And when the people in power abuse that power, the institution isn't destabilized by exposure, it's destabilized by the corruption that was already rotting it from the inside. A murmur moved through the room. Some nodded. Others stiffened. But none interrupted her now. Another senator, this one younger, African American, cleared his throat. Agent Carter, we've reviewed your files, the names, the evidence, and the testimonies. What we need to understand now is this: how far up did this go? How many names are we not seeing yet? Imani took a breath. This was the moment. She reached into her folder and pulled out a list, not names, but positions. What you're not seeing are the roles behind the names. Policy advisors who rewrote reporting standards to hide misconduct. Training supervisors who ignored red flags in cadet evaluations. Internal affairs officers who systematically closed complaints without review. You're not just looking at individuals. You're looking at a culture. A structure designed not to reform, but to survive. Another voice, this time from Senator Mathers, known for his aggressive style, interrupted. You're saying the Bureau is fundamentally broken? She met his gaze. I'm saying it was built with cracks. We just stopped pretending not to see them. There was silence again. And then the final question came from an unexpected place. A senator who hadn't spoken all session leaned forward. Her nameplate read Senator Diane Sloan. Her tone was softer, but her words were sharp. Agent Carter, you've carried all of this alone for a long time. What has it cost you? The question struck harder than any accusation. Imani's eyes dropped for a moment. She thought of the nights without sleep. The paranoia. The relationships lost. The loneliness. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. I lost my peace, she said. I lost the idea that justice was a thing that moved on its own. But what I gained was truth. And truth is heavier, but it's real. The senator nodded, her eyes glistening. Thank you. The hearing concluded without a final judgment. There would be more investigations, more reports, more battles ahead. But as Imani stepped out of the chamber into the sunlight of the Capitol steps, the cameras followed her, not like predators, but like witnesses. She turned to Malik, who met her at the bottom of the stairs. He didn't speak. He just opened the car door, and she stepped in. Back in Atlanta, the impact was immediate. News outlets began reporting on the deeper network of misconduct that she had outlined. Protesters gathered again, but now their chants were laced with something new: direction. Action. A call not just for change, but for reconstruction. Community leaders reached out. Lawyers filed new motions. The district attorney's office reopened cases that had been shut for years. Rosa, now working with a growing coalition of former insiders, began assembling a team to push for statewide police reform. But Imani stayed quiet in the background. She had spoken enough for now. Her voice, used so many times as a sword, now needed to rest. She spent days off the grid, walking the neighborhoods that raised her, sitting on porches with people who remembered her before the bureau, before the storm. She visited graves. She visited schools. She let the city remind her that it was still alive, still worth fighting for. Then, one evening, she received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten note. The penmanship was clean, deliberate. Agent Carter, you don't know me, but my brother was one of the names in your file. He's gone, and we never got answers. Until you. I just wanted you to know that what you did reached further than headlines. It reached people like me. People who thought no one cared. Thank you for not walking away. No signature. She folded the letter and placed it inside her notebook, right next to her badge. She didn't cry. But something inside her softened, just a little. The weight hadn't disappeared. But for the first time, it felt like she wasn't carrying it alone. Months passed. The city changed in small, almost imperceptible ways, like a deep breath slowly being released after years of holding it in. Headlines shifted from outrage to progress. Investigations became indictments. Trials began. Testimonies poured in from places once silenced by fear, and the machinery of accountability that had seemed rusted into uselessness began to turn again. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but undeniably. Imani watched all of it unfold, sometimes from the sidelines, sometimes from within, her presence a quiet but undeniable force that no one could ignore anymore. Her name was no longer a threat, it had become a symbol, etched into the public's consciousness not just as an agent, but as a woman who refused to look away. Ray Halston and Brent Mallory were both convicted. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses impossible to discredit. Their trials were public, and their sentences reflected the gravity of their crimes, not just the falsified reports or the planted evidence, but the deep harm they had caused to families, to justice, to trust. Halston was removed from the courtroom in handcuffs, still shouting, still denying, his voice cracking under the weight of consequences he never imagined he'd face. Mallory broke during the trial, not from guilt but from panic, unraveling on the stand when confronted by a mother whose son had been targeted and imprisoned because of his lies. Their names, once cloaked in authority, were now synonymous with betrayal. Deputy Director Harold Niles didn't last much longer. A new round of investigations, bolstered by public pressure and relentless evidence, led to his resignation under scrutiny. He tried to frame it as a step back for the good of the Bureau, but no one bought the narrative. The fallout from his exposure led to a wave of retirements and reassignments at the upper levels of federal law enforcement. What was once whispered in corridors was now discussed openly in strategy rooms. Change had to happen. Structural, cultural, visible change. And it had to start with dismantling the myth of invincibility so many had hidden behind. Rosa Alvarez became a recognized voice in the reform movement, leading an oversight committee built from former insiders and advocates. Her work went from backroom documents to public forums, pushing for policy that actually protected, not just procedures on paper, but real, enforceable change. She gave interviews, she spoke on panels, but always reminded the public that she was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Rosa's courage had been quiet for too long. Now it roared, not in rage, but in clarity. Malik stayed in the field, but his role shifted. He became a mentor, not just to new agents but to those who had quietly watched Imani's journey and found themselves inspired to act differently, to think differently. He and Imani remained close, though their paths diverged. He stayed grounded in the operations, while she moved towards something bigger, something less defined but more vital. They didn't need to speak often, there was a bond forged in what they survived together, one that didn't require constant words to be understood. And Imani? She didn't return to her old office. She didn't want to. Her fight had always been about more than a badge, and now she had the freedom to shape something new. When the Department of Justice offered her a leadership position in a newly formed civil rights enforcement unit, she accepted, but with conditions. She would not sit behind a desk. She would not be a figurehead. She would build the team herself. Investigators, community liaisons, data analysts, and survivors, yes, survivors, people who had lived through the damage and knew how to see what others ignored. She traveled across the country meeting victims, listening more than she spoke, learning where the next fight needed to be. Her work expanded beyond police reform, it touched education, housing, incarceration. Anywhere the system had failed, she was there, shining light into the cracks. She didn't do it for recognition. But the world recognized her anyway. Years later, when she stood on a stage receiving an award she had never asked for, she looked out at a crowd filled with faces that once would have been locked out of rooms like that and said only this: we cannot fix what we refuse to face. And we cannot heal what we continue to hide. So let us stay loud. Let us stay honest. Let us stay in the fight. And she did. Now, to you, listening, reflecting, perhaps even seeing yourself in this story, I ask you this: what would you have done in her place? When the room turns against you, when the people meant to stand beside you are the ones aiming to break you, would you still speak? Would you hold the truth even when your hands tremble? Because this story, though fictional, is built on truths too familiar for too many. It reminds us that justice isn't a destination, it's a decision. Made every day, by people who refuse to be silent. So if this story moved you, if it stirred something in your chest, made you think, made you question, then let it do more than just live in your memory. Let it challenge you. Let it travel with you into the world that needs voices like yours. And if you believe in stories like this, stories of resilience, of truth, of justice earned and not given, then subscribe to Tales of Twist. Here, we don't just tell stories. We reveal them. We unpack them. We honor them. Click that subscribe button. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. And never stop seeking the twist. Until next time.